In the year 536 AD, something happened that no empire, no prophet, and no scholar could explain. The sun still rose each morning, but it no longer shone with its familiar strength. A strange haze spread across the skies of Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. Daylight became weak and cold, as if filtered through smoke. Contemporary accounts described the sun as giving forth its light, without brightness, like the moon during an eclipse. Shadows faded. The air felt heavier. Crops struggled beneath a sky that seemed permanently veiled. This was not a local storm, nor a passing season of bad weather. It was a planetary disturbance. The Mediterranean world, already strained by political instability and economic fragility, now faced something more ominous: the dimming of the very star that sustained life. No one understood what had begun, but within months, temperatures would drop, harvests would fail, and societies would begin to unravel. The year 536 would enter history as one of the darkest chapters of the ancient world, not because of war, but because the sky itself had changed. Asterisk, asterisk, the dimming did not fade. Weeks passed, then months, and the haze remained. Across the Eastern Roman Empire, fields that should have been green in spring appeared stunted and pale. Summer brought no relief. Instead of warmth, there was an unnatural chill. Tree ring data studied today confirms what chroniclers sensed at the time. Temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped dramatically. Some regions experienced cooling of up to 2 degrees Celsius, an enormous shift in pre-industrial conditions. In Ireland, annals would later record a failure of bread. In the Mediterranean, grain shipments grew scarce. Snow reportedly fell during summer in parts of China. What began as an atmospheric anomaly quickly became a food crisis. Harvests failed not once, but repeatedly. Without surplus grain, cities that depended on stable trade networks began to feel strain. Markets tightened. Prices rose. Rumors spread. The sky had changed, and with it, the fragile equilibrium of ancient societies. Empires were built on predictable seasons. When that predictability vanished, so did the illusion of control. Asterisk, the people of the 6th century did not possess satellites or atmospheric science, but they left behind testimonies of bewilderment and fear. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, as if it were in eclipse, and that it remained dim for an entire year. The Roman statesman Cassiodorus described a sky that seemed permanently clouded, where shadows vanished and colors lost their clarity. In China, official chronicles recorded frost and snowfall during summer months, along with widespread crop failure. These accounts emerged independently across vast distances, yet they described the same unsettling reality: daylight without warmth. For societies deeply connected to seasonal rhythms, the sky was more than a backdrop. It was a calendar, a compass, and a divine signal. When it faltered, meaning itself seemed unstable. Without a scientific framework to explain volcanic aerosols or atmospheric dust, communities interpreted the phenomenon through religion, omen, and prophecy. Fear spread as quickly as hunger. The dimming of the sun was not merely an environmental anomaly. It was a psychological shock that eroded confidence in rulers, gods, and the future itself. Asterisk, centuries later, science would uncover what those witnesses could not. Ice cores extracted from Greenland and Antarctica preserve microscopic traces of sulfate particles, chemical fingerprints of massive volcanic eruptions. Around 536 AD, these layers show an abrupt and extraordinary spike. A colossal eruption, likely in the high latitudes of the northern hemisphere, possibly Iceland, had injected vast quantities of ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. There, the particles spread across the globe, forming a reflective veil that scattered sunlight back into space. Unlike weather systems confined to the lower atmosphere, stratospheric aerosols can persist for years. The dimming was not imagination. It was physics. The sun had not vanished, but its energy was filtered through a planetary curtain. The result was a volcanic winter. Growing seasons shortened. Frost struck unexpectedly. Rainfall patterns shifted. Even a small average drop in temperature disrupted agricultural systems finely tuned to stability. What ancient observers perceived as divine anger was, in reality, a rare convergence of geological forces powerful enough to alter climate on a global scale. The sky had dimmed because the Earth itself had erupted. Asterisk, the year 536 did not stand alone. In 540 AD, a second major volcanic eruption struck the planet, compounding the damage already done. Ice core data confirms another massive sulfate spike, indicating that the atmosphere had barely begun to clear when it was once again filled with ash. The result was a prolonged climatic downturn that extended for nearly a decade. Tree ring records from Scandinavia, Siberia, and North America show some of the narrowest growth rings of the last 2 millennia during this period, clear evidence of severe cooling. In parts of Europe, summer temperatures may have dropped by more than 2 degrees Celsius for several consecutive years. Crops failed repeatedly. Livestock perished. Famine spread across regions already weakened by instability. What had begun as a mysterious dimming of the sky evolved into one of the coldest decades of the last 2,000 years. For societies dependent on agricultural predictability, the margin for survival was thin. When harvests collapse year after year, resilience erodes. The crisis was no longer atmospheric. It was systemic. The environment had shifted into a state that ancient economies were not designed to endure. Asterisk, as harvests failed, the crisis moved from fields into cities. In the Eastern Roman Empire, grain supplies that once flowed steadily through Mediterranean trade routes became unpredictable. Constantinople, a metropolis dependent on imported food, felt the pressure immediately. Prices rose sharply. Rural communities, lacking reserves, were hit even harder. In Ireland, Chronicles later recorded a failure of bread, lasting several years. In Scandinavia, archaeological evidence suggests abandoned settlements and sudden demographic decline. In China, official records speak of starvation and migration. Famine is rarely sudden. It spreads in waves, eroding social order. Malnutrition weakens immune systems. Trade contracts as surplus disappears. Communities begin to hoard. In such conditions, even small shocks become catastrophic. Political authority depends on stability and provision. When rulers cannot guarantee food, loyalty fractures. The environmental crisis of 536 and the years that followed did not respect borders. It rippled through interconnected economies from Europe to Asia. The dimmed sun had become something far more tangible. Empty granaries, silent marketplaces, and a growing sense that the world itself had turned hostile. In 541 AD, as famine and instability weakened populations across the Mediterranean, a new disaster emerged. In the port city of Pelusium, in Ramon, Egypt, a deadly disease began to spread. Within months, it reached Alexandria. Soon after, it arrived in Constantinople. This outbreak, now known as the Plague of Justinian, would become the first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas that infested black rats. It thrived in conditions of overcrowding and malnutrition. Constantinople, already strained by food shortages, became an epicenter. Contemporary accounts describe thousands dying each day at the height of the outbreak. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried. The empire's administrative and military systems faltered as labor forces collapsed. Modern genetic evidence confirms that this was indeed plague, linking it to the same pathogen responsible for the Black Death centuries later. The climatic downturn of 536 did not directly cause the pandemic, but it created an environment of vulnerability. Weakened populations are fertile ground for disease. Within a single generation, environmental shock, famine, and epidemic combined to produce one of the most devastating periods in late antiquity. The Eastern Roman Empire had entered the 6th century with ambition. Under Emperor Justinian I, it sought to reclaim lost Western territories and restore imperial grandeur. Armies marched into North Africa and Italy, reclaiming lands once ruled from Rome. Monumental architecture, including the Hagia Sophia, symbolized renewed confidence. Yet the climatic crisis and the plague struck at the foundation of this revival. Military campaigns required taxation, manpower, and stable trade networks. Famine reduced tax revenues. The plague decimated soldiers and administrators alike. In Constantinople, government functions slowed as officials fell ill. Across provinces, labor shortages weakened agricultural output even further. Infrastructure suffered from neglect. While Justinian's ambitions had been expansive, the reality of environmental and epidemiological collapse forced a retrenchment. The empire did not fall immediately, but its resilience was permanently diminished. Territorial gains proved difficult to sustain. Rivals sensed weakness. The combined weight of climate shock and disease altered the balance of power in the Mediterranean world. The dimmed sun of 536 had cast a shadow far beyond the sky, reaching into the very machinery of empire. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. While the Mediterranean world struggled with famine and plague, Northern Europe endured a different kind of collapse. In Scandinavia, archaeological evidence reveals a sharp decline in habitation during the mid-6th century. Entire villages appear to have been abandoned. Burial patterns changed abruptly. In parts of present-day Sweden, up to half of known settlements show signs of sudden disappearance around this period. Pollen records indicate a decline in agricultural activity, suggesting that fields were left untended. The climatic cooling struck particularly hard in high latitudes, where even minor temperature drops can devastate short growing seasons. For communities already living near the margin of agricultural viability, repeated crop failures meant demographic catastrophe. Some scholars have linked this period to the Fimbul winter, described in later Norse mythology, a prolonged winter preceding Ragnarok. While myth and history cannot be equated directly, memory of extreme environmental hardship may have survived in cultural tradition. In these northern lands, the dimmed sun did not simply cause hunger. It fractured communities, erased settlements, and reshaped the demographic landscape for generations. Asterisk for centuries. The events of 536 were understood only through scattered chronicles. It was not until modern science compared records from Europe, the Middle East, China, and the Americas that the true scale became clear. Ice cores from Greenland revealed sulfate layers corresponding precisely to the mid-6th century. Tree ring studies across North America and Eurasia showed synchronized growth suppression, beginning in 536 and intensifying after 540. Even in the high Andes, evidence points to climatic disturbance. This was not a regional anomaly. It was a hemispheric, possibly global, climatic event. The volcanic aerosols dispersed around the planet, altering atmospheric circulation patterns and weakening monsoons in Asia. Crop failures in China were documented alongside Mediterranean famine. The dimming of the sun connected distant civilizations through shared hardship. Without trade routes or communication linking them directly, societies experienced the same atmospheric disruption. The 6th century crisis stands as one of the earliest documented examples of global climate shock. It reminds us that long before modern globalization, the Earth's systems were already deeply interconnected. The darkness did not lift overnight. Atmospheric particles gradually settled, and the veil that had muted the sun began to thin over several years. By the late 540s, temperatures slowly stabilized, though not uniformly across regions. Agricultural systems, however, did not recover as quickly as the climate. Fields abandoned during famine required labor to restore. Populations diminished by plague could not immediately replace lost workers. In many areas, recovery was uneven and fragile. Political structures that had endured the crisis emerged altered. The Eastern Roman Empire survived, but weakened. In Western Europe, shifting demographics and economic contraction contributed to broader transformations often associated with the early medieval period. The crisis of 536 did not end civilizations outright, but it accelerated transitions already underway. Environmental stress, combined with epidemic disease, reshaped economic and political landscapes. The return of sunlight did not erase the memory of instability. It marked the beginning of a new era, defined less by imperial certainty and more by adaptation to uncertainty. Asterisk, the year 536 did not leave behind a single monument or battlefield to mark its arrival. Its legacy was written in thinner tree rings, in chemical traces locked within ancient ice, and in the fragmented words of chroniclers who struggled to describe a sun without strength. Unlike wars or conquests, this catastrophe had no visible enemy. It emerged from beneath the earth and unfolded silently across the sky. Its consequences were diffuse yet profound, altering climate, weakening empires, and preparing the ground for pandemic disease. Modern historians and climate scientists now regard this period as one of the coldest decades of the last 2 millennia. Yet to those who lived through it, it was not a statistic. It was hunger, uncertainty, and the unsettling realization that the natural order could falter. The 6th century crisis reminds us that history is not shaped solely by human ambition or conflict. Sometimes it is shaped by forces far beyond intention, by volcanic ash rising unseen into the upper atmosphere, dimming the sun, and quietly rewriting the course of civilizations. The events of 536 and the decade that followed did not simply disrupt harvests. They marked a pivot in the trajectory of late antiquity. The Mediterranean world, already transitioning from classical structures into something more fragmented, absorbed a shock that accelerated transformation. Urban populations declined. Trade networks contracted. Monetary circulation weakened. In some regions, ruralization intensified as cities lost their economic gravity. What historians once described broadly as the Dark Ages now reveals a more complex picture, one shaped not only by political change, but by environmental destabilization. The cooling period and subsequent plague outbreak reduced manpower, strained institutions, and reshaped demographics across Europe and parts of Asia. While civilizations endured, their scale and structure shifted. The crisis of 536 did not destroy the world of antiquity overnight, but it altered its momentum. It reminds us that climate has always been an unseen force in political history, capable of amplifying existing vulnerabilities and redirecting entire eras. Asterisk, for more than a millennium, the dimmed sun of 536 remained a mystery buried in scattered texts. Only in recent decades has science revealed its full magnitude. By comparing ice cores, tree rings, volcanic deposits, and written chronicles, researchers reconstructed the sequence. A massive volcanic eruption in 536, followed by another in 540, triggering prolonged cooling and atmospheric opacity. This interdisciplinary convergence has reshaped our understanding of the 6th century. It demonstrates how fragile, complex societies can be when environmental systems shift abruptly. It also highlights how deeply interconnected the planet has always been. A volcano erupting in the North Atlantic could darken skies over Byzantium, and weakened monsoons in Asia. The crisis of 536 stands as one of the earliest, clearly documented global climate shocks. It is a reminder that human history unfolds within planetary boundaries, and when those boundaries are disturbed, consequences ripple across continents. The sun did return. Gradually, the haze thinned. Harvests stabilized. Populations recovered over generations. Empires adapted or transformed. The world did not end in 536. It changed. And in that change lies the deeper lesson. The year the sun disappeared reveals how civilizations stand at the mercy of forces far older and larger than themselves. Yet it also reveals resilience. Communities rebuilt. Trade revived. New political and cultural formations emerged from the instability. The 6th century crisis was not a single dark year, but a decade-long ordeal that reshaped the early medieval world. Today, the evidence lies frozen in polar ice and encoded in tree trunks, silent testimony to a time when daylight itself faltered. If this journey into one of history's darkest years expanded your perspective, consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, and sharing your thoughts. Which historical turning point should we uncover next? The fall of Rome? The Black Death? The Bronze Age collapse? Let us know in the comments, and together we will continue exploring the moments when the Earth itself changed the course of history.